All right, today we're going to be continuing with our discussion of the Roman Republic, and we're going to pick up where we left off last time, which is in the middle of the Punic Wars, kind of a cliffhanger. We were talking about in the last session not only the origins of Rome and the early monarchy, but the birth of the Republic and the early expansion, the beginning of the Roman Empire for the most part. And it's really the first Punic War that brings Rome to its first, I guess you could say, overseas conquest. Prior to the first Punic War, prior to 265, Rome had conquered a good portion of the Italian peninsula, but really nothing beyond that. With the first Punic War and their defeat of Carthage, they ended up taking territory in Sicily, and then later Sardinia, Corsica. So they're out into the islands of the Tyrrhenian Sea and the greater Mediterranean, but they still haven't built very much. So what we're going to begin with is kind of a very brief recap of the aftermath of the First Punic War, which is going to set us up for the Second Punic War and really the most important of the Punic Wars. And I will introduce the great enemy of Rome, a guy by the name of Hannibal, somebody that you may have heard of. So let's pick up with the recap. The interbellum era. This is the period between the First and Second Wars. That's what interbellum actually means, between the wars. So Carthaginian mercenaries after the First Punic War were in revolt. The bankruptcy of the Carthaginian state prevented them from really being able to pay a lot of the mercenaries, and after they had to deal with these revolts, which also included the revolts of territories in Sardinia and Corsica, which were eventually given over to Rome, the general Hamilcar Barca, who was one of the most important generals during the First Punic War, ended up going to Spain to try to expand Carthaginian power and recoup some of the money that was lost by Carthage. Now, Hamilcar has a grudge against Rome. He wants payback for the defeat in the First Punic War, and when he goes to Spain, he actually takes with him his sons, the most important of them, his son Hannibal. And the story is that he had his sons swear an oath that they were one day going to avenge themselves on Rome. And this kind of set up the at least the personality traits of Hannibal and his brothers with their animosity toward the Roman Republic. Now, in 226, the Carthaginians signed a treaty known as the Ebro Treaty with with Rome, which set up the Ebro River. So here's a map of Carthage. Carthage, again, is in the blue, or kind of purplish blue, North Africa, and now into Spain, the territory in Spain, up to the Ebro River, right there, is the territory that would be Carthaginian sphere of influence. And that treaty was signed so that Rome was kind of out of that territory. They could, have interaction with any territory north of the river Ebro, and that was pretty much where they draw their boundary, okay? Now, the Romans, however, also have a treaty with the city of Saguntum. Now, notice on the map, Saguntum is not on the north side of the Ebro River. It's on the south side. It's in Carthaginian territory. Now, this is not going to escape Hannibal, okay? This is not going to... let's just kind of hold off 1 second. I'll tell you what's about to happen. You can maybe see what's about to happen right there. Second Punic War is going to begin 218 to 201. It's another long war. Now, Hamilcar's revenge is, like I said, his son Hannibal. His date's 247 to 182. The war actually begins with an assault on Saguntum. Now, of course, it's not an actual war with Rome, but it is an assault on an ally of Rome, and that's where the problem is going to occur. It's on the south side of the river, so Hannibal sees it as an opportunity to maybe bait Rome into war, since it is an ally of Rome. He attacks Saguntum, figuring Saguntum is going to call over to Rome and get some help, which they do, not in time. The city is actually taken, but the Romans do end up declaring war against Carthage over this offense, which is exactly what Hannibal wanted. Now, the plan was for the Romans to send troops into Spain and then down into Carthage to end this as quickly as they could. So in 218, when Rome declares war, they're going to send their general Publius Cornelius Scipio to Spain. Tiberius Sempronius Longus was going to go to Carthage, but before the generals could depart with their troops, Hannibal, who is already in Spain, decides to preemptively sneak his forces into Italy. while the Romans were unexpecting, this was rather unexpected because, number one, the time of year happened to be kind of late fall. It was a time when he needed to cross through the Alps, and the Alps are the highest mountain range in Europe. And when you go up into the Alps during that time of year, you're already dealing with cold weather, right? The higher up you go in the elevation, the more difficult it is to cross through the snows and all that kind of stuff. And he brings with him an army of maybe 40,000 troops. You've got elephants, You've got other mercenary groups that are working with him. And then he's got to not only cross the Alps, he's got to deal with the Gallic tribes and other tribes that are in his way. So he has a difficult time crossing. He has several engagements where he at first has to defeat some of these groups, but eventually he makes a number of allies along the way. The big problem crossing the Alps is, again, loss of manpower. Out of the 40,000 or so troops that he starts with, about 25,000 survive. And if you think about the conditions of crossing through these narrow passageways up in the mountains in the snow, you can imagine with the pack animals, with the elephants, with all this kind of stuff being brought along with him, and the troops kind of not spread out, but in kind of a line of march. You can imagine the guys in the back of the line following different animals. And if anybody's ever walked through snow, you know how it gets really slushy, as you trod through it. And you can imagine the animals, which are, they go to the bathroom where they need to go to the bathroom. And you're probably walking through not just snow and slush, but, animal feces and all kinds of horrible situations. So it's not only the cold, but it's going to be the disease that's going to get your soldiers. So he loses a good portion of his men and needs to recoup when he eventually arrives in Italy. But luckily, the Romans weren't expecting this. Generally, you don't fight during, the cold season. They definitely didn't think he was going to cross through the Alps, so he takes them by surprise. And once his troops, recover, heal up, you got a few engagements that take place. First of all, at the Battle of Cannae, where Scipio is defeated fighting Carthage, and he himself is wounded. The next battle is one of, I'd say maybe one of the three big losses of Rome early on in the war. It's called the Battle of the Trebia. Now, Sempronius Longus was the Roman general at Trebia, and he had the Roman camp. One of the things that the Romans did is when they sent their armies out, they would always build camps so that the Roman soldiers can sleep and prepare for the battle. Same thing with the enemies. Of course, Carthage is going to do the same thing. And at Trebia, you've got the river, which I'm showing you on that little diagram. This is kind of a schematic of the battle. The Roman camp is on one side, the Carthaginians on the other side. It was December. It was a very, very cold time of year. The Romans, who are trying to get ready for the battle, are harassed. This is where Hannibal shows some of his brilliance, kind of psychological tactics. He sends some of his troops to the Roman camp at night to harass them, to keep them up, to taunt them, to provoke them. And Sempronius happened to be kind of a short-tempered general, fairly ambitious, and really wanted to get at Hannibal as much as he could. So here he is being annoyed by the troops that are outside the camp, and when the morning comes, he ends up sending the Roman troops out to engage the Carthaginians without breakfast, basically without sleep the night before, on a very cold day. They're lined up on one side of the river, and Hannibal's lined up on the other side of the river, and he gives foolishly the order to advance across the river. Now you can imagine just getting into a cold swimming pool. Here you've got troops in armor, without sleep, without food, cold day, entering a freezing cold river and trying to come out the other side and being able to fight. Very, very bad planning on the Roman part. You can imagine the cramping of muscles and fatigue and just coming out of the water to engage the enemy. Anyways, make a long story short, which I probably have already failed doing, it's a decimation. The Romans lose between 15,000 and 30,000 men in this single day's combat. Hannibal loses fairly few. After that, you've got another important loss on the Roman part. This is going to be the loss at Lake Trasimene. Gaius Flaminius was a Roman general. He's basically trying to pursue the Carthaginian army, and he comes to Lake Trasimene. Now, this is in the summertime. This is, I'm kind of fast-forwarding a little bit, but during the summertime, it was a morning where they're passing along the coast of the lake. Here's Lake Trasimene on the schematic. That little passageway is basically the route that the Roman army is taking. And in the red, you can see the Roman army. But you can also see in the blue where the Carthaginians are placed, kind of hidden up in the hills, in the trees. And it was a very foggy morning when the Romans began going around the lake, thinking Hannibal's entire forces on the other side, not knowing that they're passing right alongside. And Hannibal, of course, has these guys hidden for ambush, and using the fog to his advantage and the terrain to his advantage and all the things he always uses to his advantage. When he gives a signal, they kind of rush down, side swipe the Roman army and drive them into the lake, again decimating the Roman army. And again, at least 15,000 men or more are destroyed at Trasimene. Okay, so the Romans are off to a really, really bad start in the Punic War. Hannibal seems to have absolute control of any territory he goes into. The emergency measure is taken where they put a dictator in charge. This was actually part of the Roman system. A dictator is not an illegitimate leader, but it would be a single leader to take the place of the consuls. Remember, the consuls in the Republic are the two lead magistrates and the heads of the state and the leaders of the military. When you have emergencies, they would have the dictatorship, which would be a 6-month term of office. And Fabius Maximus is the guy that is made dictator. Now, Fabius realizes we're going to keep losing if we keep making these foolish attacks on Hannibal. He's just too good. He's too brilliant. What we need to do is stop engaging him. Avoid these massive defeats and follow him around. The key is we can make sure that our allies in Italy remain on our side, make sure that Hannibal doesn't have the chance to gain further support, and basically just wait it out. Because with so small an army in a foreign territory, in an enemy land, at some point Hannibal will probably give up hopes of taking the city because he's not going to take Rome, right? Rome has these walls. He doesn't have an army that can really lay siege to the city. If you wait it out, maybe you'll win. Now, that was called the Fabian strategy. And it was a decent strategy. Unfortunately, dictatorships end, consuls come back into power, and sometimes you've got ambitious individuals such as Varro and Paulus. All right, these are the consuls in 216, and they decide they're going to engage Hannibal again. And they're going to engage him in southern Italy at a place known as Cannae. If you have, some of you may have heard of Cannae. This is one of the most famous battles in the Roman Republic. Now, the advantage that the Romans have, numerical. They've got at least twice the men Hannibal does. They've got a bigger army. They've got the battlefield right there. But Hannibal really picks the position. Hannibal lines his troops up in the right spot. Hannibal has better strategy where he's going to be able to defeat a larger army with a smaller army. And you need to always realize that in the history of warfare, it's not always the bigger army that wins. Very often, a smaller, more skilled army can defeat a larger army. Okay, so numbers aren't the whole story. As a matter of fact, the way the numbers are used in this battle kind of shows you the foolishness of the Roman strategy. So basically what happens that day, and you can take a look at the plan. This is famous. This is what Hannibal's most famous for, the double envelopment. The Roman army's in the red. You could see how many guys they have. I mean, they're stacked deeply, line after line after line after line. Hannibal's troops are kind of scattered out in a particular position where they're very mobile, thinly stretched to extend all the way across the field. And on the day of the battle, when the Romans start to advance, what Hannibal does brilliantly is allow his center of the line to retreat. And he retreats so that the Romans push into the gap, thinking that they're driving the Carthaginians back. And of course, what they're doing is actually falling right into the envelopment, where the Carthaginians are now going to surround the Roman army, sending in their cavalry from the back and stuff like that. So it's a slaughter. As a matter of fact, the Romans are so tightly packed in this massive troops, you can imagine if you're in the middle of that group, the only guys that can fight are the guys on the front line and on the edges. So you can imagine as they're, squeezed in by the Carthaginian army surrounding them, the majority of the Romans can't even do anything. They're just sardines in a can waiting to be killed. This was literally a slaughter. About 60,000 Romans died on a single day at Cannae, which was about 20% of the adult male population of Rome, the fighting force. They lost a number of senators that were present. Several consuls, ex-consuls died. It was a disaster. Now, the big advantage that Carthage ends up after this victory, not only that they really defeated Rome, really this should have been the end of the war, to tell you the truth. It was such a devastating defeat. But Carthage is able to get an alliance at that point, which they've needed, with Philip V of Macedon. We've already talked about the Macedonians, right? We've talked about the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia. This is Philip V. Philip was interested in certain territory that the Romans had access to along the Illyrian coast, the Dalmatian coast. He doesn't really want to engage with the Romans over it. Carthage wants some help from Macedon, some support. So they both see this as the perfect opportunity. Philip sees kind of safe to make an alliance with Carthage. Carthage seems like they're going to win the battle, gives me my opportunity to take what I want without losing very much. And the Carthaginians also get a secondary alliance with the great city of Syracuse in Sicily. All right. Now, Philip kind of makes the mistake of assuming Rome wasn't going to do anything about him because they're so occupied with Hannibal. But the Romans kind of go back to the Fabian strategy. Let's not fight Hannibal. And they're going to be able to turn some of their attention towards Macedon. So what happens, I think we'll get to that a little bit later. Well, here's the war with Macedon, 215, that begins. All right, Rome is going to deal with Philip. I'll talk more about that a little bit later because I want to cover again the conquest of Greece or the annexation of Greece. But for now, what's going on back in the Punic War? Syracuse, who's made an alliance with Hannibal, is laid siege 213 to 212. The great city that had held off the Athenian assault way back in 416 now is going to actually fall to the Romans. The Roman general Marcus Claudius Marcellus. This is a very important event. I'll probably mention Marcellus a little bit later because not only does he defeat Syracuse, take the city, which also results, by the way, in the death of the very famous scientist Archimedes. You've probably heard of Archimedes before. He's the one that famously yelled, Eureka. Archimedes is actually killed by a Roman soldier during this sack of the city. But Marcellus ends up bringing a lot of the art back to Rome after this. And that's really going to, in a way, revolutionize Roman culture, this new exposure to massive amounts of Greek art, coming out of Syracuse. Anyways, the tide is also going to turn in Spain. Remember, the Carthaginians control Spain, and Hannibal's brothers are in Spain. In 211, Publius and Gnaeus Scipio, this is the two brothers, the Scipio brothers, lose at the battles of Castullo and Illorca against Hasdrubal and Mago, who are the brothers of Hannibal, and they're killed. So the Romans are still not doing very well against Hannibal's family members. In 210, the son, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the younger Scipio, and this is going to be the most important Scipio, ends up bringing his troops to Spain. He ends up taking the city of New Carthage in 209, and then at the Battle of Baecula, he defeats the Carthaginians, but is not able to capture Hasdrubal, who continues on into Italy, trying to reinforce his brother Hannibal. Now in 207, his troops are stopped at the Battle of Metaurus by Gaius Claudius Nero. And what's worse, not only was he stopped and the reinforcements don't get to Hannibal, but Hasdrubal himself is killed. And to make it even worse for Hannibal, his brother is decapitated. And I don't know why the Romans did this, but they sent the decapitated head to Hannibal's camp. Talk about, poking the bear, right? So one offense after the other. Hannibal is not going to be happy about this. Unfortunately, the Romans are now going to start to win really decisively. Scipio, who is the one who won in Spain and basically, took Spain for the Romans, decides to move to North Africa. He's going to take the war to Carthage itself, and he's ultimately going to get the name or the new name added to his. He's going to be known as Scipio Africanus. And he is going to defeat not only Carthage and Spain, but he's also going to defeat them at Carthage. Now, the plan of invasion of North Africa was to hopefully have the state of Carthage call Hannibal back home to defend the city, which is exactly what they do. So after 15 years or so of Hannibal loose in Italy, with the Romans unable to stop him, finally Italy is relieved of that burden, And the showdown is going to be set for Scipio versus Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. This takes place in 202 BC. Now, Scipio is one of the greatest of the Roman generals, and he learned from watching the tactics of Hannibal. He saw how Hannibal used his psychology. He used the territory. He used all kinds of different battle strategies very effectively, and Scipio is a good student. Now, when he goes to North Africa, he actually has the better troops. He's got a more experienced army, his veterans from Spain. The army that Hannibal has at his disposal are mainly new recruits that have been called up. His veterans, have been at war for 15 years in Italy. They're getting old, the ones that haven't already been killed. Okay, so he doesn't have an experienced force the way Scipio does. And Scipio decides to play psychological game with the Carthaginians. He has the Carthaginians look at the troops at the Roman camp training, right? He uses intimidation tactics. He actually gets a hold of elephants. Now, he knows that the Carthaginians are going to use elephant troops against his army. And one of the big problems with elephants is it spooks the horses. So where you have cavalry, the horses don't really like the smell of the elephants and really is disruptive. Plus, the elephants themselves are basically like tanks. They can just batter through a Roman infantry formation. But he gets a hold of elephants ahead of time, actually keeps elephants with the horses at the Roman camp, gets the horses used to it. And one of the most important things that he does is he pulls over some allies, the Numidians. This was a group that was located right near Carthage. They were native North Africaners. Massinissa was their leader, and they were really well known for being great cavalry troops. All right. Scipio picks the battlefield, and on the day of the battle, he basically uses Hannibal's own tactics against him. If you look at the diagram on the screen there, you see the red. Those are the Roman troops. When the elephants are set out against the Romans are smart enough using, remember, those maniples that we talked about last time, those small little units, to open up basically roadways in between the forces. So if you could see on this diagram, what they're trying to show you there is the arrows are the elephant troops going through, because elephants aren't stupid. They're not going to run up against a bunch of guys with javelins and spears if there's a clear path to go through. And the elephants actually just go through the Roman army. The Roman army then reforms and engages the troops with the elephants kind of out of the picture. But in the end of the day, Hannibal loses. This is really his first and only loss during the Carthaginian War, but it ultimately ends up with Carthage surrendering. Rome has won the day. Again, losing a lot along the way, they just don't give up. This is, again, something I pointed out before. The Romans endure through some of the worst situations. Their willingness to stick it out and their unwillingness to quit ultimately lands them with the empire that they end up gaining. Okay, and here they're going to gain more territory, particularly in Spain. So at the aftermath of the Second Punic War, you've got more territory added to Rome. The Third Punic War is almost not even worth mentioning. This is years later, between 149 and 146. In the intervening years between the wars, one of the most prominent politicians in Rome was a guy by the name of Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Elder. He actually died right around the time that this war was beginning, and he was famous for the tagline, Carthago delenda est, which means Carthage must be destroyed. This is what he said at the end of any speech that he ever gave. Well, maybe, not necessarily every speech, but it doesn't matter what the speech was about. He could have been talking in the Senate about, the water supply to the city of Rome. He would still end his speech with this catchphrase. He was just pushing for a more aggressive policy against Rome's enemies. And his wishes are carried out, even though he didn't live to see this. 149, the opportunity presented itself. The Carthaginians violated the peace treaty after the Second War. They were responding to aggression in North Africa by the Numidians. Rome responds by saying, you need to, pay up weapons and ships. And what is the straw that broke the camel's back? They tell Carthage, you need to abandon your city and move down inland. Now, which you can't do, right? Carthage is a naval power. It's a trading power, right, by sea. If Carthage was going to leave their city on the coast and go inland further south into Africa, that would be it for Carthage. And the Romans knew that. Okay, that was their excuse to declare war, because Carthage was not going to abide by those demands. Carthage is laid siege, and by 146 the city is taken, and Scipio Aemilianus, the brother of Scipio Africanus. No, it's not. Sorry, not the brother. This is descendant. I believe adopted descendant. I forget off the top of my head, but is the one that destroys the city in 146. Okay, and the story is kind of an apocryphal story that the Romans, sowed salt into the soil so nothing would ever grow there, and that's also not true. It was a later story, but they did destroy the city, and later they'd plant a new colony on the spot. So Carthage is not going to disappear from history, but Carthage going forward is going to be a Roman Carthage, not a Carthaginian or Punic Carthage. Okay, so that was the end of Carthage. But what about the other portion of the Mediterranean? What about the Greeks? was already said there, engaged with the Greeks beginning after the Battle of Cannae. Philip V foolishly makes an alliance with Hannibal. Rome turns their attentions to Philip at that point. From 215 to 205, right in the midst of this Punic War, they end up sending troops to Greece. Unexpected, right? Philip was not expecting this. Anyways, Rome gets an alliance with Pergamon at the time, King Attalus I, and an alliance with some of the Greek cities just south of Macedonia, a league known as the Aetolian League. Ultimately, they defeat Philip, but they make a peace treaty with him and then bring their troops home. They weren't interested in conquering Macedonia. They've got other things to worry about. Okay? So that wasn't their intention. The Second Macedonian War from 200 to 197 is again where Philip asserts his power. He's actually made an alliance with the Seleucid king Antiochus III. I know this is maybe a flashback to when we covered the Hellenistic period, so I don't know if this is just a nightmare for you, but very confusing era. And this alliance was against the Ptolemies, but also the Romans and the Pergamon kingdom. And Rhodes end up calling Rome to, again, help out in Greece. Ultimately, the war is going to be concluded with the defeat of Philip again at the Battle of Cynocephalae. Okay, that's in 197. And then the Roman general Flamininus ends up declaring all the Greek city-states free of Macedon. He goes to the Isthmian Games, the Pan-Hellenic festival there at Isthmia, right by Corinth. And he proclaims this to great applause. Okay? So, again, the Romans are not interested in staying. They're not interested in governing. They liberate the Greeks, and then they return home once again. Now, that wasn't it. Their involvement in Greece is going to continue. If you remember, right after that war, there is the Roman Seleucid War, or the Syrian War, from 192 to 188. Antiochus III, who's now trying to advance his power into Asia Minor and Greece, or at least further into Asia Minor. He's going to be defeated in Greece at Thermopylae, famous place for the old Persian War. And then he employed the archenemy of Rome, Hannibal himself, one of his generals during this war. And here Hannibal is not going to perform the way he did once upon a time. At the battles of Eurymedon and Myonnesus, Rome, along with the allies from Rhodes, actually defeat Hannibal in successive battles. And then later at the Battle of Magnesia, Scipio Asiaticus and Humanities II end up defeating Antiochus III, ending the war. All right, and again, Rome is going home. All right, they don't take over any territory really at that time. And then just to follow what happens with Hannibal, because in the intervening years, Hannibal finally meets his end. 182 is going to be the death of Hannibal. Hannibal, after being a kind of a mercenary general advising the Seleucids, ends up seeking shelter in the region of Bithynia with King Prusias, who is going to be giving him some kind of shelter and protection from the Romans, who are really out to get him. This is like the ancient version of the search for bin Laden. Hannibal knew that the Romans had troops that were trying to track him down. Eventually, the Romans arrive in Bithynia, and he's betrayed by King Prusias, who tells the Romans exactly where Hannibal's hiding. Now, Hannibal had a house built at that time with a number of different exits, including, secret passages, so that if the Romans ever did close in on him, he could escape. Unfortunately, when the Romans do surround his house, apparently they blocked all of these exits, so they were able to find out about his escape plans, and Hannibal ends up committing suicide. Rather than being taken back to Rome, paraded through the streets in a triumph, which would have been a huge event should this have taken place, he doesn't let them have that pleasure. He commits suicide by taking poison. And that was the end of the great boogeyman in Roman history, the death of Hannibal. But we're not done with Greece. The Third Macedonian War, 171-168, the son of Philip V, Perseus, tries to reassert Macedonian power. Ultimately, he loses, and Macedonia and the kingdom, the whole Antigonid dynasty, ultimately ends at that point. Macedonia is carved up and made into 4 separate republics, kind of on the Roman model, that were hopefully going to not cause any further trouble. But there's one last resurgence of Macedonian power, or an attempt at resurging Macedonian power back in 150, 148. You have the Fourth Macedonian War, where Andriscus, who apparently is a pretender to the throne of Macedon, is the threat. Rome defeats him at the Battle of Pydna and ends the war. At this time, there is one final conflict, which is going to be a battle with the Achaean League in 146, an alliance of cities a little bit further down in Greece. And ultimately, the Romans crush the Achaean League, destroy the ancient city of Corinth. As an example, this is the same year they destroyed Carthage. Rome was apparently taking a very harsh line with their enemies, right? Decimation of cities. As a lesson, right? Don't oppose Rome, or rather don't become a rather big nuisance to Rome. And at this point, they decide just to stay. Greece is now theirs. They end up turning that into a province of the empire, and Rome continues to grow. And Greece is going to continue to have an impact on Rome. Some people say, the Romans conquered the Greeks, but then the Greeks ultimately conquered the Romans when it comes to culture. Of course, that's not exactly the way the phrase goes, but it's good enough for now. A few years later, 133, the last of the Attalid kings of Pergamon dies, Attalus III, and being a longtime ally of the Romans, he ends up giving in his will the entire kingdom of Pergamon to the Romans. So the Romans gain a large chunk of territory right there on the coast of Anatolia. And a large amount of wealth that comes back into Rome from this, which is going to set up this next really important issue. So let's talk about the aftermath. What happens after wars that have been lasting literally for decades, right? The Romans have been at constant war. This can't be good. If you don't know anything about the Roman military setup, remember I said it was not a professional army. The Romans were citizen soldiers. To fight in the Roman military, you had to actually be a landowner. You had to have a certain amount of wealth. Right? This is basic qualification for citizenship in the ancient world, both in Greece and in Italy. So the soldiers, for the most part, were small landholders. A lot of these guys were, again, the farmer soldier, the kind of guy that worked hard, worked the land, but when it came time to defend the state, took up his weapons and went out to fight. All right. Now these guys are at war for years and years, far from home in some instances. You can imagine what this does back home to the land that they left behind and the families that they left behind. Now, in the course of conquering all these new territories, particularly Sicily and other places in North Africa, what Rome begins to import, besides just booty from war and wealth, they start to import grain from overseas. Sicily in particular was a huge breadbasket of the Mediterranean. And a lot of the overseas grain coming into Italy is going to be cheaper than the native grown grain. And this is going to cause a problem for the small landholder who's not going to be able to sell their grain. It's going to hurt them financially. Plus, with them being away at war and these farms not necessarily doing all that well, a lot of times these smaller farms are going to take out loans from some of the wealthier class, some of the wealthy senatorial class maybe. Now, as these farms ultimately go into bankruptcy, the senatorial class ends up kind of gathering more power, more land. You end up with a lot of the soldiers coming home, end up being landless, right? They're losing their territory, homeless veterans. That's going to be a big problem. So you have unemployed, landless farmers who are now going to try to figure out what to do with their lives, and a lot of times they're going to go to the cities, right? Hopefully to find work, to support their families, to do all those kinds of things. Okay, Ager Publicus, which it says there on the slide, basically is the public land, the land that belongs to the state. That was also controlled by the senators because the Roman state itself owned land. Now, when you go to the cities to try to find work, you've got another import that is going to be a problem. Not only are you importing cheap grain, you're also importing really cheap labor in the form of slaves. The ancient world, and it's not unusual, it's not particular to Rome, that the economy for the most part, ran on slave labor. This was kind of a universal throughout human history all over the world. There's nothing new here. But the Roman citizens, or the former landowners, are not going to be able to get jobs. So you have a situation with homeless, unemployed Romans packing the cities. A potential for mob violence escalates as you have more and more people moving into these crowded situations, demanding different types of relief from the state. And you're beginning to move towards more and more of a welfare state, where Rome is going to have to find out what they can do to keep the people calm. You don't want them rioting. You don't want them... Of course, sometimes you actually do want to use them as rioters, and we'll see how this works out in the late Republic. But the other consequence is not just the packing of these people into the cities, but it's also going to be the repercussions for the military. Because remember, the military required land ownership as a qualification to become a soldier. So with fewer people owning land, you have less people to draw upon, less manpower that you could draw from to keep the military strong, and the Roman military is going to shrink. Okay, so this is the situation that we now are going to try to resolve, and it's going to be an attempt to resolution by a couple brothers, really the two most famous, are the Gracchi brothers. Now, I'm going to get to them in a second. I think that's actually on the next slide. But this, in the context of this situation, you also have the birth of a couple political parties in the Roman state, what are known as the Optimates and the Populares. The Optimates are the political party that basically favors the Senate, kind of the traditionalists, over the popular assemblies. They're very conservative. They're definitely aristocratic for the most part, and they follow what's known as the mos maiorum, the way of the elders, the way of the ancestors. That phrase, mos maiorum, is kind of what the Romans pointed to. When you want to know how you're supposed to do things, we do things the way they've always done it, the way the ancestors did it. Now, the Populares were the popular party. They wanted to push legislation through and reform and all these kinds of things through the voters, by taking things directly to the people, the commoners. And this is going to, in a way, divide Roman society very heavily. Now, a couple of the most important populare leaders were the Gracchi brothers. They're both going to be tribunes of the plebs, right, lower classes. Even though you have equality, you still have the tribunate in place, which still has the power of the veto. And what these brothers are going to attempt to do, one after the other, they're tribunes in different years, is they're going to try to pass land reform, agrarian reform for the state. So Tiberius Gracchus in 133 tries to put a land bill through that divides up the public land to redistribute it to the people that don't have land. Okay? He's also going to try to establish limits on land ownership to prevent any senators from, gaining too much territory in Italy. And he's going to try to use the wealth from the inheritance of Pergamon, right, that city that was bequeathed to Rome, that same time. He wants to use money from the kingdom of Pergamon to fund a board for ongoing land distribution. Now, this legislation, really popular with the people, not popular with the Senate. As a matter of fact, what makes it even worse is he tries to ram the legislation through by going directly to the assembly, contrary to the mos maiorum, contrary to custom. And what results is a senatorial reaction that leads to a mob riot. Right? The senators know how to use the mob as well. Right? The mob's there. If you can pay it off, you can manipulate it. You could turn the citizens against different political opponents, and that's what happens. Tiberius is killed along with 300 of his followers in a mob riot. So that's one way you could try to handle political disagreement. Not necessarily the best way, but you're going to see we're getting near the end of the Republic. This Republic is fragmenting, and you can see it happen right before your eyes here. A few years later, the brother Gaius Gracchus, tribune of the plebs, 123-22, tries to do the exact same thing. He passes through not only land reform the way his brother does, but he also tries to put price controls in place to reduce the grain prices so that the poor people will be able to get grain at low prices, which is going to, again, hurt the economy. He also tries to deal with what are called the extortion courts. These are the courts that used to try senators or politicians for corruption and things like that. And the interesting thing about these courts is that the judicial power was actually in the hands of the senators themselves. So it was kind of slanted so that if a senator was brought up on charges, it would be easier for them to get off. So Gracchus wanted to put the courts into the control of the equites, which are basically the middle class, the knights. Okay. Again, this is going to upset the senators very much. And they also want to expand Roman citizenship to other Italians outside of Rome. All of this has to be dealt with, and the senators use some of the same tactics. You have another mob riot. Gaius Gracchus ends up committing suicide, realizing that everything was pretty much over at a certain point, and that brings an end to their attempts at reform. So right now you could see the society in Rome very much fragmented. And this is going to set the stage for a period that we're going to refer to as the Civil Wars. So let's talk about the fall of the Republic. It's basically the last 100 years of the Republic. 3 civil wars are going to take place. Some of these individuals that I'm about to talk about, you've definitely heard of. These are some of the biggest names, most famous names in Roman history. So let's start with some of the lesser-known characters. We'll start with the guy known as Marius. Now, Marius, and this is not a picture of him, this is just a picture of a soldier, but Marius was one of the great generals of the late Republic. In the Jugurthan War, which is a war that was fought against King Jugurtha in North Africa, he was serving under the consul Metellus. The war was going on for quite some time. The war lasts from 112 to 106. And Marius was not pleased being under the command of Metellus. He thought Metellus was somewhat incompetent. He wasn't able to defeat the Jugurtha, and ended up in 107 going back to Rome, running for the consulship and being elected consul so that he could take command of the army in North Africa. As the head guy. Now, he was what's called a novus homo, which means a new man, meaning he's the first person in his family to hold the office of consulship. So this is a really prestigious moment for his family. He, again, takes command, goes to North Africa, defeats Jugurtha, ends the war, and gains incredible popularity back home. Right? He's going to be a populare for the most part, right? The people's man. And he used the assembly actually to get elected, or actually to get command. Now, this idea of going directly to the popular assembly, we already saw how that backfired against the Gracchi brothers, but this is also going to be a tactic used by other politicians. Another threat that comes up shortly after the Jugurthan War are the Germanic tribes that are now coming into contact with the Roman Empire to the north in Europe, the Cimbrian, the Teutons. From 104 to 101, Marius holds successive consulships, his second, third, fourth, fifth consulship. Even runs for one of the consulships, his second, while he was not even in Rome, which was not something you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be present in the city for the elections, but he wasn't. He ended up defeating the Germans. Now, this engagement with the Germans was not brand new, but this is the beginning of a long, several centuries of conflict with Germanic tribes. And ultimately, when we get to the fall of Rome much later, we're going to look at the impact of some of these groups on the Roman Empire. But for now, Rome is securing its borders, and Marius is behind that. What happens next is the really important revolution in the military, what are called the Marian reforms. Marius changes the game. He's going to create for the first time a professional army, and he starts by exempting the minimum property qualification for soldiers. So if you did not own land, no longer an issue. So if you were an unemployed Roman in a city who didn't have work, you could join the military as a career. You could be a paid soldier, okay, with the promise of retirement, and the pay was going to come from the general. And you'd be paid not only in money, but you'd be paid in land upon retirement. So this is big. This is going to be a way to really boost the Roman military, which it does. A lot of people go into the military as a career. And these guys would be kept occupied. I mean, you want to keep the soldiers busy, even if you're not at war, since this is a professional army, not a temporary army. These guys were referred to very often as Marius's mules. So this is a picture of the soldier here. He's equipped like a Roman would be. He's got the pila, he's got the shield, he's got the chainmail armor, but on his back he's now got this pack which he carries with him, which includes tools. So while these guys weren't fighting, they were moving around, building roads, building bridges, the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. You've probably heard the phrase that all roads lead to Rome. Well, those roads extended for thousands of miles throughout the empire, and they're primarily built by the Roman army, this professional army that Marius creates. But there's a problem. Because this army, and you might even see the problem coming, when this army is loyal and paid by their generals, it really sets the stage for true civil war. Right? This is basically like having Roman generals with private armies that are now going to be able to range across the empire. Anyways, around 100 BC, he holds his sixth consulship. At this time, you've got a tribune by the name of Lucius Appius Saturninus who tries to pass new land reform, price controls, etc., and actually kills his political rivals. Riots result, and Marius has to step in and try to help the Senate put this down. Ultimately ends with the death of Saturninus, and afterward Marius basically retires from public life for a while. Things were still not settled. The state is in some ways in chaos. What follows is going to be the social war. This is actually going to bring Marius out of retirement. In 91 BC, another tribune by the name of Marcus Livius Drusus, who ends up being assassinated because of this, he actually tries to extend citizenship again to the free Italians in Italy. This was not popular again with the Senate, but when his assassination takes place, it sparks a war. The Italians who want Roman citizenship by this point rise up, and from 191 to 88, you have the social war. The Socii, which are the allies of Rome, revolted over this issue. Marius comes out of retirement. Another general comes on the stage that we're going to need to talk about, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He was an aide. And then at the end of this encounter with the Italians, the Roman government passes the Lex Julia, or the Lex Julia, which is basically citizenship granted to any of the non-rebel Italians. All right, so if you didn't rise up against Rome, you were granted your citizenship. So eventually, this is going to be something Romans start to extend to further and further groups of people, but it starts in Italy, and it's really important. Right at this point, you have a war that breaks out in Pontus. Mithridates VI, king over on the Black Sea, starts moving into Greek territory, which was held by Rome. Now, it's this war that is going to bring about, in a way, the first civil war. In 88, Sulla, the guy that we just talked about as one of the generals in the Social War, was elected consul. The Senate gives him command to take the troops against Mithridates in Asia. The tribune at the time, Rufus, who again wields the veto, tries to veto the appointment of Sulla to the war command. And the popular assembly then decides to vote that command to Marius. Now, this is going to bring about a rivalry between the two. Marius, who gets the people's support, Sulla, who has the Senate support, but Sulla also has an army. And the civil war begins when Sulla goes up to the city of Nola, where he's got 6 legions stationed. This is his legions after the Social War. And he marches his legions on the city of Rome. He's the first Roman general to do this. He seizes control of the capital, drives out the Marian opposition, and issues what are called prescriptions, which are basically the death sentence to his political opponents. Hundreds are killed by Sulla. And then he goes off with his army to Pontus to fight Mithridates, which is exactly what he wanted. In his absence, Marius returns. In 87, he comes back and takes the city. His co-consul, the consul Cinna, ends up declaring Sulla an outlaw, and the two issue new prescriptions, this time against Sulla supporters, where, again, hundreds, thousands are killed in the aftermath. Right after that, Marius is elected to his final consulship, his 7th consulship, I think setting the record for most consulships in a single life, but doesn't last for very long. He dies less than a month into his term of office. And it leaves Cinna against the supporters of Sulla. Now, Sulla wants to come back and just settle things once and for all. And so he kind of wraps up things in Pontus with Mithridates. He defeats Mithridates, but not decisively, ends up signing a peace treaty so he could return to Italy, which he does in 83. As soon as he gets back, he's supported by a couple guys we're going to talk about shortly, Marcus Licinius Crassus and a guy by the name of Gnaeus Pompeius. They were his supporters and also generals at the time. In 82, you have the famous Battle of the Colline Gate, where Sulla and Crassus crush the Marian army. Again, Marius is long dead, but his army is still out there. And then Sulla is appointed dictator. Right? So Sulla ends up at the end of the First Civil War as the man in charge of the state. And he didn't get the 6-month normal term limit. He's got dictatorship without a term limit. Now, what he does is kind of controversial. He uses the power to basically shore up the senatorial power, the upper class. He issues a number of prescriptions again. This is the new policy, I guess. When you're put into power, you get rid of your enemies. Over 9,000 people are assassinated on Sulla's orders. Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar, the famous Julius Caesar, who is still kind of a young, relatively inexperienced general at this point, or a politician. He was a Marian, by the way, supporter of Marius. He was a nephew of Marius, had to flee. He was later spared. He wasn't actually killed, obviously, but this is what was going on, and he was scared for his life. But the reforms that Sulla institutes are going to be things where the Senate has to approve all bills. Bills can't go right to the popular assembly. They have to come through the Senate. The plebeian assembly actually loses its power to initiate legislation. The tribunes lose their veto power. Then tribunes are actually barred from holding any other office. So if you hold the office of tribunate, you can't run for other office after that, which is going to hopefully dissuade people from becoming tribunes. The Senate is packed, right? Talk about packing a court. The Senate is doubled in size from 300 members to 600 members, and then he packs the Senate with his supporters, the optimates, okay? He limits the consulship. You have to, you still have a 1-year term, but you have to serve it in Rome. Following year, you go off and have a governorship in one of the provinces, and you cannot run for consulship again for 10 years, right? You're not eligible for re-election after that for 10 years. And then you have the cursus honorum. The cursus honorum is basically the order of magistracy. When you go into politics, there's a certain order of office that you're supposed to work your way up through. You don't just run right for the consulship. You start with lower magistracies. Well, he sets age requirements. You can't be consul till you're at least 42 years old. And then those extortion courts, he gives them back to the senators. So you could see how this is going to be really, really unpopular with the people, kind of a top-down tyranny in a way, putting way too much power into the hands of that senatorial class. So what's going to happen in the aftermath? Well, Sulla eventually steps down, which is unexpected, right? Here's a guy with all power in his hands. In 79, he decides to retire and let the system work itself out. He dies not long after that. Now, left behind, a couple of his supporters, Crassus and Pompey. Let's take a look at them. One of their most famous engagements has to do with a very famous slave revolt, probably the most famous slave revolt in all of history, the slave revolt of Spartacus. Now, Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator, right? So he's not just an ordinary slave. He's a warrior slave. The gladiators we haven't really talked about, but this was big sport. This is big money. This is big entertainment in Rome. The majority of gladiators were slaves, but not all gladiators were slaves. Gladiators could be, free citizens that are competing for the money and for the fame. They were kind of like superstars, even though they were not necessarily free men. In 73, the revolt breaks out, and Spartacus ends up getting himself an army of over 70,000 people, gladiators and slaves from various places, particularly in southern Italy. He starts in Capua. Marcus Crassus, is the general who eventually defeats him. It takes a while. Spartacus defeats a number of Roman commanders before Crassus. But after Crassus defeats him, he crucifies the army that survives. 6,000 slaves are crucified and line the road, the Appian Way, from Capua all the way up to the city of Rome, kind of as an example. Pretty harsh, pretty gruesome, but not uncommon to deal with criminals and especially revolutionaries in this way in ancient Rome. Now, the weird thing is that Pompey, who is not the one who defeated Spartacus, ends up getting the credit for the defeat of Spartacus because there was a contingent of Spartacus's troops that broke away and were trying to make their way north in Italy, out of Italy. And Pompey ends up countering this small contingent, defeating them, and is kind of hailed as the great victor. This is going to begin a little bit of a tension between Pompey and Crassus, but the two ultimately are going to come to power in a way together. Now, a little bit of a background. Pompey, he's definitely one of the greatest generals of his day. He viewed himself as kind of a new Alexander the Great. As a matter of fact, that little statue of him, this bust of Pompey, you can see the hair on his forehead kind of swept up in kind of the Alexander style. That was a choice that he made. Crassus, the other figure that's showing on the screen, he was the richest guy in Rome. And kind of shady, if you want to know. He made his money, for the most part, through land speculation, and he ran a private fire brigade. So you don't have a state-run fire department, but let me explain how this worked. Crassus would hear about a fire taking place in Rome. This is not uncommon. Somebody's house is burning, somebody's apartment complex is burning, whatever. It's burning and they need assistance. So here comes Crassus with his fire brigade to put out the fire. And what he does is he starts negotiating with the guy that owns the land. He says, I'll put out the fire if you sell me that house or sell me the property. I'll offer you maybe $50,000 for it. Okay. Or sesterces or whatever you want to call it, Roman money, right? I'll offer you this much. And the guy's like, well, I don't want my house. I don't want to sell my land. I just want you guys to put it out. So, put out the fire. And then he'd, while the house is burning, start to lower his offer. Well, I'll give you $40,000 for it. And as the guy is sitting there watching his house burn and the offer getting less and less, at some point, the guy will basically sell the land for a lower amount. And Crassus ends up, really developing this stuff and becoming, like I said, the richest man of his day. Now, these guys are two ambitious personalities, and they become consul together in the year 70. They issue a number of reforms that are actually pretty good. They reverse a number of the things that Sulla does, like restoring the power to the tribunes, restoring the extortion courts, partly to the equites and partly to the Senate, kind of share the power. But, some good things, ultimately. And then we have kind of the reputation of Pompey we got to look at briefly. So you got another war with Mithridates. Remember, Mithridates had a peace treaty signed after Sulla, but the war begins again, the Third Mithridatic War from 73 to 63. By the end of this, Pompey is going to be the chief general in command in Asia. And in 66, he defeats Mithridates VI, gaining a pretty important victory, goes on to basically freed the Mediterranean from piracy. The Roman navy he uses to kind of wrap up the engagement with the Cilician pirates in the east. And then Rome basically bragged that that there was no more piracy during the Roman Empire, which may have been fairly true. I mean, the Roman navy did dominate the Mediterranean. In 63, Pompey continues on to end the Seleucid Empire and then conquer Syria and Judea, which we already talked about when we covered the Hellenistic kingdom. So Pompey is gaining reputation, he's gaining wealth, he's incredibly popular, and we need to now turn towards a few other individuals. Let me introduce a few more players in this period. Next individual is actually not a general, but a very important politician. 63, he becomes consul, a guy by the name of Marcus Tullius Cicero. I just want to introduce Cicero because I know I'm going to mention him not only later today, but in future lectures. He was another new man. He's brand new, first man in his family to hold the consulship. He comes from the equestrian class, so he's not a senator. He's not an optimate. He's not a populare. He's kind of in the middle. But he's really well known for being one of the great thinkers of his day, political theorist, interested in philosophy. He was a great rhetorician. He was a great speaker. One of the most famous things he's known for is what's known as the Catiline conspiracy, where this guy Catiline attempted to seize control of the state. He had this plot that he hatched against Cicero. It was uncovered by Cicero. Ultimately, the plot fails, and Cicero has the supporters of Catiline executed without a trial. And this is going to be really controversial a little bit later. It's going to come back to haunt him. But that's Cicero. He's going to kind of play the middle in what's about to be the second civil war. Anyways, Pompey, after his victories in the east, wants a triumph, demands a triumph. He wants land for his veterans granted by the state. He wants a ratification for his eastern acquisitions. And he is opposed, so he ends up making an alliance, along with Crassus, with another up-and-coming politician by the name of Caesar. Right? I already introduced him briefly. And they're going to form what's called the First Triumvirate, which is a political alliance. It's going to last from 60 to 53. And in it, they're each going to support each other in their political aspirations. They're going to kind of send their own supporters to kind of support the other in various elections and manipulations and stuff. Anyways, Crassus basically wants tax privileges in various places, particularly, most likely, Syria, Palestine. Pompey wants ratification of his eastern conquest. He wants land for his troops. Caesar's interested in the consulship, right? Hasn't been consul yet. He has done some work in Spain. He decides he's going to pass up a potential triumph, which is a really big deal. Triumph is a major parade after a victory abroad. Anyways, he wants to pass that up to run for consulship. Cicero kind of opposes this whole idea of this alliance because it's an extra-constitutional thing. It's not an official government office or anything, so he's a little bit wary of what's about to happen. But ultimately, it leads to Caesar's election as consul in 59. After his year as consul, he goes to a proconsul position as governor of Gaul. 58 to 54 was supposed to be his governorship, and during this period, he fights what are known as the Gallic Wars. He actually writes the history of the Gallic Wars. These are his own memoirs about his war with the Gauls, and conquers the rest of Gaul, ending with basically the Battle of Alesia, where he defeats Vercingetorix, which is the great Celtic chieftain who withstood him for some time. Vercingetorix is later brought to Rome, where he's strangled to death as part of a triumph. He also launches the first invasions of Britain. Twice he tries to bring troops into Britain, fights a few skirmishes, but doesn't really stay. Basically furthers his power and his popularity by sending his memoirs back to Rome. The people back in Rome were huge fans of Caesar. He actually sent wealth back to the people as well. And he's going to become obviously a threat with his popular appeal. Of course, the alliance is short-lived. It ends up ending with two deaths. In 54, Caesar's daughter Julia dies. Now, Julia was married to Pompey. This was part of the way you sealed this agreement, through this marriage. Now, Pompey apparently really loved Julia. Caesar, was his daughter. He loved her too, and they were both grieving when she died. But unfortunately, Pompey ended up taking another wife, which happened to be an enemy of Caesar's, from a family that was, opposed to Caesar. So in a way, this kind of breaks Pompey from the alliance. 53, Crassus, who's out in Parthia trying to deal with the Parthians, is betrayed, ambushed, killed, and of course can't be a member anymore himself after his decapitation. So you end up with a rivalry that is now going to be between Pompey and Caesar. This is going to be the second civil war. In 52, Pompey becomes sole consul, and it's partly due to some rioting that's going back in the city. There is the Senate that is supporting Pompey, but you've got groups of people in the city that have taken sides. Claudius, who happens to be a tribune of the plebs and a supporter of Caesar's, has his own mob. Milo, who happens to be another politician who has a mob, and they're kind of Pompeian supporters. These guys are at odds with each other. Ultimately, it results in an assassination. Claudius is killed by Milo. Cicero actually tries to defend Milo unsuccessfully against, the accusation of murder. Claudius's funeral actually takes place at the Senate house. In the funeral pyre, ultimately, the whole Senate house actually burns down at this point. And after that whole scenario, this is when the Senate decides you're just going to make Pompey consul by himself. Milo is actually running for consulship, but Pompey for this year is going to be the only consul. So effectively, he's dictator for the year. Now the Senate starts to pit Pompey against Caesar. And in 50 BC, the Senate orders Caesar to resign his command, which he has overstayed. He stayed in Gaul a little bit too long. They ordered him to disband his army, return to Rome, and Caesar knew that if he obeys the Senate orders, he's going to be brought up on charges of corruption and various things, railroaded, and found guilty. So Caesar decides, I've got only a couple choices here. He would like to run for the consulship to protect himself, and he wants to do it from Gaul. They say, no, you need to be back in the city to do that, so they're trying to get him back however they can. And they ultimately, Pompey and the Senate, declare Caesar a public enemy. Caesar's response is by actually marching his army into Italy, crossing the Rubicon, which is this small stream river that was the boundary of his territory. And you weren't allowed to bring your army outside of your territory legally. And he does this. He crosses the Rubicon. You've probably heard that phrase, crossing the Rubicon. He says, the die is cast, alea iacta est. And then he crosses over, knowing his very action of marching across that river was tantamount to declaring war on the Roman state. And Pompey realizes this. So immediately, knowing Caesar is on his way to Rome, Pompey abandons Italy, pulls his troops out, along with his supporters and the senators backing him, leaving the city of Rome to Caesar. Pompey regroups in Greece. Cicero, who's actually trying again to play the middle ground and force these guys to some kind of reconciliation. He wants to avoid at all costs a civil war. And both Caesar and Pompey want his support because, he's brilliant and a great speaker. Cicero actually kind of drops out of politics at that point and kind of fed up. Later he comes back and ends up siding with Pompey. But when we get to the actual war, Caesar goes to Greece, showdown with Pompey at Pharsalus, and Pompey loses. Unexpectedly, Caesar defeats him. Pompey then flees from Greece to Egypt, where he attempts to get some refuge and regroup to carry on the fight. And when he is received by Ptolemy the 13th, expecting, hospitality, he's instead executed by the young pharaoh. Now, Caesar, of course, follows and arrives in Alexandria, right, which again is an independent Ptolemaic kingdom. And very upset when he finds actually Pompey's head presented to him on a silver platter, basically. The pharaoh thinking this is going to win Caesar's favor. Unfortunately, it doesn't. Caesar is incredibly offended that anyone would dare execute a Roman general, particularly somebody that used to be his friend, and supposedly Caesar wept when he was given the head of Pompey. Anyways, Caesar does not support Ptolemy the 13th, but rather his sister, his older sister, who is a claimant for the throne, and this is Cleopatra, who we've talked about before. There's a civil war in Egypt, Cleopatra versus her brother, and Caesar basically is the decisive factor in the victory of Cleopatra from 48 to 47. Caesar's troops ultimately defeat Ptolemy. He himself is killed fighting. Portion of the city is burned. Even the library, the Great Library of Alexander, takes some damage during this time. And Caesar ultimately takes up with Cleopatra. They become lovers. He stays for a while in Egypt. She becomes pregnant. Later gives birth to Ptolemy the 15th. Ptolemy Caesar, also known as Caesarion. This is the son of Caesar by almost everybody's agreement. Of course, Caesar has to return back to Italy at some point. He has to finish up with the supporters of Pompey in Spain, but ultimately he finishes the civil war, pardons his opposition. Cicero is given pardon. Marcus Junius Brutus, who is a very important name we're about to see, also forgiven by Caesar, and doesn't last long. What happens, we're going to eventually get into the famous Ides of Martius. Caesar's made dictator, and he's made dictator perpetuus, meaning dictator for life. This is rare, and this is where Caesar, I think, makes his greatest error. He starts to hold numerous powers and offices, which are ultimately constitutional, but how he does it really is suspicious. He's consul, he's proconsul, he's tribune. He has tribunician power, veto power, and the imperium in his grasp. He is elected Pontifex Maximus, which is the head priest. We'll study Roman religion later. He has his face. First time a Roman politician has a face put on a coin. This would usually be reserved for the gods. He has actually a priest dedicated to himself, almost, again, another declaration of his own godhood. He has a college of priests dedicated to his family. He becomes the praetor morum, or the head of the morality of the state. He wore the triumphal robes, almost like a king. He really does look like a king. As a matter of fact, he places his statue among the statues of the older kings. Now, this is where his mistake is. Rome does not like kings. And that very same guy who he had forgiven earlier, Marcus Junius Brutus, whose very family, right, Brutus, if you remember way back to the end of the monarchy, it was Lucius Junius Brutus, one of his ancestors, who overthrew the kingship. And Marcus Junius Brutus kind of wants to stand up to his family's reputation as being a tyrant slayer, as an opponent to kings, organizes an assassination plot. And in 44 BC, on the Ides of March, at the theater of Pompey, remember the Senate house was burned down. The Senate was meeting at the theater of Caesar's old friend / enemy, Pompey. The assassins spring their trap. They gather around Caesar, kind of isolate him from some of his supporters, and stab him to death. Immediately, these assassins, thinking they're going to be really popular, had mobs attack them, and they eventually flee from Italy, realizing they just killed a man that the people loved, Caesar, and there was payback coming. So the second triumvirate, this is going to be, now approaching the final end of the Republic, so bear with me a little while longer. A second triumvirate is formed after the death of Julius Caesar. This was an official office. This was an emergency office to reorganize the Republic, which is crumbling before everybody's eyes. And they're given what's called the Imperium Maius, meaning the greater imperium, meaning these guys are the lead generals above everybody. And the three individuals are Marcus Antonius, which was Caesar's right-hand man, one of the great generals under him, Gaius Octavius, which is Caesar's grandnephew, who he adopted in his will, so it's his new adopted son, so he's going to become known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and Caesar's cavalry commander, a guy by the name of Marcus Lepidus. These three guys are the second triumvirate. They issue prescriptions. Cicero was one of the people listed in this, these assassination documents, basically, and it was because of his Philippics. Cicero launches a series of speeches known as the Philippics, after the speeches given by the great Athenian orator Demosthenes against Philip of Macedon. These are famous speeches from way back when. These Philippics are directed at Mark Antony. All right, so he was really an opponent of Antony politically, and Antony wanted him listed, and he was listed. He was proscribed, assassinated, and then his head and hands cut off and were nailed to the rostrum, which was the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum. So it's a pretty gruesome end to one of the great minds of the late Roman Republic. Later, you have the battles against the various assassins. Antony and Octavian ultimately defeat them. Battle of Philippi in 42 is followed by the suicide of Brutus and his co-conspirator Cassius, the two most famous conspirators. And ultimately, these guys take over the state, and they divide the empire. Octavian is going to hold the west. Antony is go to the east, and Lepidus is kind of shuffled off to Africa, where he's not going to be much of a player. So we're going to look at a rivalry that now grows between Octavian in Rome and Antony, who goes to Alexandria. And here's the great triumvirs: Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. So what happens with Antony? Well, he takes up with Cleopatra, the former mistress of Caesar, now Antony's lover. And this apparently is quite a romance. He spends time in the east. Egypt was wealthy. He has the power of the Ptolemies behind him. He spends time in Athens and Ephesus and, of course, Alexandria. He begins to identify himself with the great god Dionysus. He's also fairly famous for his drinking and partying, and had a very, boisterous personality and popularity with his troops. He goes to war with the Parthians in the east. He has goals of expanding Roman territory. He reconquers Judea, which actually was lost to the Parthians for a little while, and secures the kingship for a guy by the name of Herod. Someone we'll tackle about later when we do Judea. Herod the Great is put in at that time. Now in Egypt, with his affair with Cleopatra around 41, he has a number of children with her. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the two children, twins, I believe, from Cleopatra, who he later installs while children as kings over different provinces of the East. Now, in his alliance with Octavian, Octavian has a marriage set up between Antony and his sister Octavia. This is supposed to secure their bond, and it's a good marriage. Octavia is one of the great examples of the devoted wife in Roman history. Of course, Antony basically abandons her, living in Egypt with Cleopatra and ignoring his wife, ultimately kind of divorcing her. He does have some children with her, but he's more favorable towards Cleopatra. And this is what's going to ultimately tear apart the alliance, especially his treatment of Octavian's sister. Now, Octavian, realizing he could play a propaganda war. This is very interesting if you ever study Roman art. If you look at the art of the period, Octavian really casts himself as a new Apollo, where Antony is in the guise of Dionysus. And if you know anything about Greek religion, Apollo and Dionysus are the yin and yang, right? Apollo, god of order and harmony and beauty and music, and Dionysus, who also is associated with music, but with the chaotic, wild, uncontrolled aspects of nature. They're polar opposites. Antony has now offended Roman sensibility also. He's abandoned a Roman wife, taken up with a foreign queen. He's had a triumph, actually celebrated in Alexandria of all places, which was, something very, very wrong in Roman eyes. He, like I said, installed his children as rulers in the East. He recognizes Caesarion, the child of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, as Caesar's legitimate heir. That's a direct slap in the face to Octavian, who is Caesar's adopted heir. Divorces Octavia in 33, and then Octavian obtains Antony's will, which happened to be on reserve in the city of Rome with the Vestals at the Temple of Vesta in the Forum. And then he reads Antony's will publicly, which included his request to be buried, not in Rome, but in Alexandria. Everything was set up for Octavian to go to war, but not with Antony. He decides to declare war against Cleopatra, declare war against Egypt. Octavian was a sharp politician. He knew that if this looked like another civil war, it wasn't going to be very popular. So he doesn't want it to look like a civil war. It's not Rome against Rome. It's Rome against Egypt. And the war is effectively settled fairly quickly at the Battle of Actium in the year 31. Antony and Cleopatra, the naval battle, had their ships present. Octavian, his main admiral or general, Marcus Agrippa, face off against them. And in the midst of the battle, Antony and Cleopatra ultimately leave the battlefield. Cleopatra's ships sail away. Antony follows her. And after a short battle, the remaining Antonian supporters switch sides, and it's a victory for Octavian. They both flee back to Egypt. And what happens afterward, Mark Antony commits suicide in his desperation. And then Cleopatra, after meeting with Octavian and ultimately surrendering, realizing she would be brought back and paraded through Rome in a triumph, decided to take her own life rather than suffer that humiliation. So she famously has a serpent smuggled into her, and she is bit by the poisonous serpent and dies there in Egypt, robbing Octavian of his victory, but ultimately ending the Ptolemaic kingdom. It becomes a new province of the Roman Empire. And we now move on to the end of the Republic. So let's just talk about the first emperor, and this is Octavian. With his victory over Mark Antony, it's the beginning of what we can call the Pax Augusta, or the Pax Romana, meaning the peace of Rome, which is going to last from 31 BC to AD 180, like 200 years of really internal stability. Doesn't mean there's no war, but it means there's no civil war, really. You might have a few things that do take place. I don't want to make it sound like there's none of that either, but overall, it's a period of prosperity. It's like the golden age, really, of Rome. 27 BC, Octavian decides to retire. He's going to step down. He's the sole man in charge of the state after the Civil War. And this is where he's really brilliant. He realizes, I think, that the state can't really survive without somebody governing it. And if he just turns power over to the Senate, you're going to end up with the same old thing happening over and over again. But he retires nonetheless, kind of still a young man. And the Senate says no. And this is what's called the first settlement. They said, you can't retire. You need to remain in control of the state. And they actually grant him a title, which is the title of Augustus. And this is the title he's going to use. So he's going to be known from this point forward, 27 BC, as Augustus Caesar, or Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. And he's going to reign all the way from 31, essentially, as leader of the state, to his death in AD 14. Long life. He dies in his late 70s. But he's going to succeed where his father, Julius Caesar, fails. He, number one, doesn't want to look like a dictator. He doesn't want to look like a king. He doesn't want to look like an emperor. As a matter of fact, he doesn't go by that. The title he prefers is princeps, meaning the first citizen. This is where we get the title prince from. He wants to be one among equals. And he shares power with other political officials. He wants it to look like a fully functioning republic. So he holds the consulship, but then he stops. He doesn't want to do this for the rest of his life. He stops doing that in the year 23 and decides to hold lower offices like proconsulships until his death. He holds the office of Pontifex Maximus. It's important to control the state religion. He's an imperator. He's a general. He has imperium. As a matter of fact, he's granted by the Senate the imperium proconsularis major, meaning the greatest imperium. So he's the lead general of the state. He has ultimate military authority. And he's also given the tribunica potestas, which is the veto power. So with those two powers, he's ultimately in charge of things, but he's doing things in legitimate ways, legitimate offices, never as king, which is really why he survives, until a natural death in AD 14. Now, the question of succession is going to be difficult because he, again, is not a king. He can't just pass power to the next in line, though he grooms people for the position. Now, when he is preparing for a succession, he didn't have any sons. He has a daughter, Julia, who he marries to numerous individuals. First to Marcellus, who was a great general, somebody Caesar or Augustus really liked, would have liked probably to have succeeded him. Of course, Marcellus dies young, doesn't leave any children behind. So Julia is then married off to Augustus's best friend Agrippa, who's much older than her. They have a number of children. 4 children, as a matter of fact, and 2 boys, Lucius and Gaius, are ultimately adopted by Julius Caesar years later. But Agrippa, he's first in line for succession, but he dies before Augustus does. Like I said, Augustus adopts his 2 grandsons, kind of grooms them for office, but they both die rather young. Augustus is then forced to adopt the stepsons by his wife Livia, Drusus and Tiberius, who he grooms to be successors. Drusus dies rather young. It seems like everybody he wants to succeed him dies, leaving the only person left, his adopted son Tiberius, who will be the next emperor, and not necessarily Augustus's favorite individual, but a guy that was fairly competent. And I'm not going to go there. That's kind of it for the Roman Republic, though the Romans didn't realize it was the end of the Republic. For the Romans, it looked like the Republic was still alive. Augustus tried to make sure that was the case. But of course, we have now actually entered the period of empire. So when we pick up Roman history again, I'm going to go away from it for a little while. When we come back, we're going to pick up with Augustus, his successors, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and then we're going to hopefully be able to see what happens to the rest of Roman history as it eventually works itself out. So that is it for the Roman Republic. Next time, we're actually going to take a look at Roman religion. So until then.